people are marching and they're calling for statues to come down and history to be taught. For example, the history of the Liverpool riots is not taught in the schools in the UK. So black people don't know that they rioted already. From June to December, and then some. But we who are concerned with the immediacy of African independence and unity are not prepared to wait upon the evolution of history. We are prepared to give history a revolutionary push. The words of Asajifo, Dr. Kwame Nkrumah. We're going to go to the phone lines now. Online, Dr. Michael Barnett. Dr. Barnett is no stranger to the Africa Forum, but just to tell you that he's a senior lecturer in the Department of Sociology, Psychology and Social Work at the University of the West Indies, Mona. He's a board member of the National Council on Reparations. He's an author of The Rastafari Movement, a North American and Caribbean Perspective, and he's a co-editor on the book Leonard Percival Howell and the Genesis of Rastafari. Michael joins me on the line. Michael, good morning.
Yes, good morning, Cabo.
Greetings. How are you doing?
Fine, man, fine. I just listened to a conversation with Ross Miguel and it was very comprehensive, man.
Yes. Well, we're going to broaden it also by adding a bit more to it from your own perspective. Miguel has always been the go-to person in a very serious way when we are discussing Pinnacle, Rastafari business generally, but Pinnacle specifically, and Leonard Howell. A wealth of information there, and his body of work on this is phenomenal. He's mentioned in almost all the texts, for example, on Leonard Howell.
Well aware of that. That's why he's part of the book that we co-edited on Leonard Howell. Myself, Clinton and Jelani. We put together an anthology. And Miguel has an article in there. We couldn't leave him out,
So let us look now on the impact and significance of Leonard Howell. I want to pick up from where we left off, because we're talking about land ownership and the importance of land and owning land to being independent, to being liberated. We talk about the liberation struggle. I don't know if you can talk about it without putting in that land ownership. And as I was saying to Miguel, this also was critical to Leonard Howell. You also have done a lot of research on Leonard Howell. Michael, talk to us about that element, that specific element of Leonard Howell, and how relevant this is as we go forward. We're in 2020.
Leonard Howell recognized the importance of black empowerment and being self-sufficient and independent, because you have to have a base on which to leverage action, and that's based on power. And people need to realize that if you're powerless, you're not really in a position to be making demands as such, because power listens to power.
Yes.
So that is why Honorable Marcus Garvey himself, he was a trailblazer. He was preaching black empowerment, obviously, and he set a precedent. Well, he set a example with his founding of the Black Star Line Steamship Company, the Negro Factories Corporation, and a range of businesses, because, economic power, land ownership, all these are things that one must seek to acquire if one wants a power base. And this, I have to say, from a critical perspective, is where Rastafari has fallen short thus far.
But can we talk about that, Michael?
Howell now recognized the importance of land ownership. That's why he acquired Pinnacle. That's why he negotiated with Alfred Chang. And in my estimation, he did buy the land and was an owner, because they were there for 16 years, basically, until the eviction. 1940 is when the community was founded, and then you had that first raid, the Ganja raid in 54, and then finally eviction in 56. Now, importantly, they were there on the land, and there were attempts to move the community from the land because Rastafari was seen as a public nuisance from ever since the early 30s. You know, when he was tried for sedition and so forth. In fact, there's even a letter that Bustamante had written to the colonial authorities in 1939, making a case that Leonard Howell was a nuisance to the community. I'm not going to read the letter verbatim, but just to say that Rastafari was seen as
well. If you have the letter there, let's hear a part of it.
All right. So the letter reads, and this is by Alexander Bustamante, and he writes to the colonial secretary in Kingston. He says, "Sir, serious trouble is brewing at Port Morant in St. Thomas, owing to the mischievousness of a man whose name is Howell, leader of this terrible thing that is called Rastafari. This man, I understand, went to the asylum once. He subsequently went to prison for 2 years for sedition, which bordered on the line of high treason. In St. Thomas, he is endeavoring to put one group against another group, and I would not be surprised if something serious happened to him and that a riot does not take place there because he is fomenting serious trouble. I strongly suggest that you have this matter communicated to the Inspector of Police for St. Thomas, because it would be very good for the government to receive a report from said Inspector of Police, as he is very anxious and concerned about the existing affair. It seems to me that the only right and proper place for this man, when he's talking about Leonard Howell, is the asylum. He is a danger to the peace of the community. I think he is the greatest danger that exists in this country today, and I believe the police can confirm this. Yours sincerely, Alexander Bustamante." So,
Michael, hold on there, because I'm listening to you. I'm my blood boiling. I'm mentally truth. But because you see, just like Van Sertima said, whether something happened 10,000 years ago, or 10 years ago, or 15 years ago, it occupied the same space in the consciousness once you become aware of it. When we do not know our history, we will make heroes of our enemies. It is simple. Go on, Michael. I know you're not going to go there with me, but that's where I'm going, right? Because that's a letter from a national hero. This terrible thing called Rastafari from Bustamante.
But you see it foments in Coral Gardens in 63.
Yes.
Because, Bustamante wasn't fond of Rastafari. I mean, it's truth be told, But having said all of that, no. Leonard Howell built and he managed to establish a self-sustaining community, Pinnacle. But, the fact of the matter is that, this was a community or within a wider nation.
Yeah.
And the thing where the pretext of the first raid was ganja. And as Miguel Leonard said, when they did the raid, they found that many members of the community had a whole heap of money. I mean, they didn't bank it, so probably under the mattress or so forth, they find 800.
Because they were thinking, as Miguel said, they were thinking more of their own banks. And this is why I want to talk to you about the impact, and the implications of the thinking of Leonard Howell.
Well, self-sufficiency, land ownership, this is a model, this is a pretext that he set and he established. So there is in and of itself, there is a model there that people can look at. Models have been set and models have been established. Now, the thing about it is that we can look at the success of the model, but we have to also look at what led to the downfall as well. So you have to take a complete historical analysis of this and in a very level-headed way say, okay, because the reality is that if you are seen as subversive in a certain one respect or the other, then you can be pulled down. You can be if there is a possible pretext for it. Now, ironically, ganja now has become an industry. We have the medical marijuana industry and so forth. But Rastafari have long been persecuted on the pretext of having ganja and using ganja. really from years, from decades ago. We know this. So, all said and done, though, I just want to say that where I am, though, right now, is we're trying to look at solutions. I am on the board of the National Council of Reparations, and I'm also a member of the Internal Reparations Subcommittee. And
I want to go right there with you, Michael, but before you go there, let's go back to a point you made earlier, just now. You said, we look at the success of the model, but we also have to look at what caused a downfall of the model. And I'll go a step further, and I want you to help us to talk about the downfall, but to go a step further as to why the model was never repeated. Or was it repeated, and did it fail again?
It has to an extent been repeated, and I'm going to give kudos to Prince Emmanuel, Charles Emmanuel, the commune that we have over at 9 Mile, Bull Bay, what we call Bubba Hill, some people call it Zion Hill. That is a model then of self-sufficiency and so forth, trying to emulate what happened at Pinnacle. But unfortunately, recently that community has been ravaged, and I have to say has been intimidated,
set upon
to an extent by there's a lot of gun violence in that area and so there has that community
within the Ethiopian Africa Black International Congress, we saw another manifestation of the Leonard Howell's model, but you're saying that also has failed.
Well, it's I don't say fail, but it's failing.
It's failing.
So unless there is interventions, it's not what it could be, because of what's happening in the surrounding area as well, because there is discord and so forth in that particular area,
So what would you say caused? What are some of the reasons that resulted in the downfall, in the destruction of the model? Why didn't the Pinnacle model survive?
As I said, there have been attempts at emulating. I think the closest person to it was Prince Emmanuel Charles Edward.
No, man, I'm speaking specifically.
To be honest with you, there's also the issue of what I call charismatic leadership, Sister Kabu. And what I'm saying is that Prince Emmanuel was such a strong leader within the movement, because he held what's called the first Nyabingi or Groundation in 1958, and he was able to pull in people like Bongo Watto, or otherwise known as Rasponajis, who would go on later to bring about the formation of the Nyabingi order formally, that mansion. Then you had people like Claudius Henry, who formed the African Reformed Church, was pulled into this Nyabingi congregation. So Prince Emmanuel, not just his own group, his own mansion, Ethiopian Africa Black International Congress, he pulled in all the other leaders, showed leadership, and he pushed, EABIC to be a formidable mansion in itself. But since his passing in 94, I would say that the mansion, it got weaker. That level of focus and direction was not as strong as it was with him having transition in 94. So what happens when you have a very charismatic and dominant leader, which some mansions do?
Yes.
Once that leader passes, the mansion is never the same unless you have succession.
Right.
You have,
and this is a shortcoming with not just Rastafari, but we see it also within the charismatic churches in Jamaica that are more African-centered in their presentation. And so you wonder why we don't have this succession planning in those spaces. Yes. We see it also in the revival churches and so on. No, could it be that it's the next step? The next step, which would be the self-sufficiency, which is what Leonard Howell had the foresight to recognize that because community was not recognized, because economy was not recognized. There's not much to develop on apart from the doctrine, and so that is not enough to hold the movement, whether it's Rastafari or revival, together?
Yeah, well, the thing with Rastafari is that it's a polycephalous movement, meaning it consists of various mansions, and people wrongly assume it's one homogeneous entity. So you have different mansions, but with some commonalities and some differences in perspective. So the challenge for the Rastafari movement is to generally come together on one accord with certain major projects and major visions. It's actually to come into one accord on certain things. So we have to realize that it does consist of various mansions,
of course,
but with the varying perspectives.
Of course,
we,
yes,
as a Rastafari, have to embrace that reality.
Yes.
Some people haven't. For instance, I'm going to just put it out there, Sister Capu, that the Howellites who are still alive today have their own way of celebrating Rastafari, which is not embraced by other members of Rastafari, by some and not. The truth is that Kumina was how they used to celebrate, as opposed to Nyabingi drumming.
Right.
You know?
Right.
The truth is that the Howellites did eat flesh, meaning, they ate goat and they ate
so too the 12 tribes of Israel.
So to the 12 tribes of Israel. So we have differences. Not all Rastafari are italists or vegetarians. So we have these differences. But my thing is, we have to embrace that reality and still come together on the common vision and commonalities. Because even there, I said, at Pinnacle, these issues of the Howellites practicing Kumina has presented some tension.
Yes, I know that.
Yes. Although it is still part of Rastafari history. In other words, prior to the Nyabingi coming into existence.
Yeah. But even within part of the colonization or colonizing education in Jamaica means that even within the wider Rastafari movement and even the Pan-African community, for those who have gone through the system, there's little understanding, knowledge, or knowing of the history, the development of Rastafari, say, for example, to understand the Howellites and how they relate back. Michael, that Leonard Howell, still, you have written about him, thank God, and we have Helen Lee and Miguel doing some work, but still is under-recognized in Jamaica. As the first Rasta, as a leader of the Rastafari, as a foundation member of the Rastafari movement here in Jamaica, he's still under-recognized.
Yes, he most certainly is under-recognized because he was, there are other first-generation leaders as well as Leonard Howell, Hibbert and Dunkley, and Robert Hines used to work as with Leonard Howell as his lieutenant, but it was Leonard Howell who, his charisma and his organizational abilities, his mobilization abilities, made him the most prominent of the first generation leaders and therefore the most persecuted because he was the one attracted most public attention. You see, the trouble with charisma and with a degree of popularity is you also become targeted. Yeah,
the leader understands that.
So one of the things you become a victim of your own success in a way. So we can look at what Leonard Howell sought to achieve, what he did achieve, and learn from that. And that's why it's important, though, to look at the entire history, the historical landscape of what he brought to the table. And ironically now, here we are in Jamaica, I think some of us are seeing the benefits of self-sufficiency, of growing what we eat and eat what we grow, and our own farming. We have very our land space here is fertile,
and specifically now, this time we're talking about that.
Yes, if we wanted to be landlocked, let's say in theory, if we wanted to be, that would be extreme, of course. We're in a situation where we depend a lot on foreign resources and so forth. But if we wanted to be landlocked, Jamaica could be, as radical as it sounds, we could survive.
We could survive. But without
actually imports of really of any sort. We could.
We have to plan.
Choose to live that way.
Michael, I'm pushing you a bit just because I have only 8 minutes left.
Okay,
only 8 minutes. And now I want to go to the point you raised earlier that you sit on the board of the National Council for Reparations with specific responsibility, you were saying, for internal reparations?
Yes. And one of the things that, and you know, we have to give credit where it's due, is that it has been sanctioned that we have this internal reparations subcommittee, and this is government sanctioned, to be honest with you. So I'm not taking anything for granted here, but we have 3 major atrocities committed against Rastafari, 3 major in terms of historical timeline. Coral Gardens, as we know, and there's been some addressing of that issue. We also have Pinnacle itself and the Howellites, which I think should also be addressed, and we have Baco Wall. But in the case of Pinnacle and the Howellites, my argument is that they who were living there, and I have the benefit of speaking to some of the Howellites, I know of the trauma they suffered from being from being literally evicted from the land, from the houses being burnt down, from seeing that beautiful community where for them was paradise in itself being destroyed. So we have people, even the children, especially Monty and Billy, who were teenagers in their late teens when they had to leave Pinnacle. They were devastated.
Right, and this is why I talk about the Pinnacle diaspora, you know, and I think it's critical for us.
It's important, and I think that we should reach out to those who are still alive. Gertrude Campbell, who was Leonard Howell's secretary, her son Louis Campbell, for instance, he's still alive. He's up there in his early 80s, but
right,
he's still
and
alive.
their descendants.
Yes.
Right, because an injustice has been done.
But
right.
No, but the thing with Louis Campbell is he lived at Pinnacle himself.
Okay.
And was old enough to have internalized trauma by being evicted. So what I'm saying is that the Howellites, there's a case for them in and of themselves for compensation and reparation for them.
Yes. So so this, you're saying this is something that is being discussed,
being addressed and so forth. In fact, we're going to have a Zoom meeting about this on Tuesday as part of the commemorations for Leonard Howell.
Oh, brilliant.
And for anyone who's interested in joining that Zoom meeting can email at a Gmail address, internalreparationsja@gmail.com.
internalreparationsja@gmail.com.
Yeah.
To sit in on the Zoom meeting. If they're interested in sitting on a Zoom meeting.
So once they email, then I'll have my assistant just send them the Zoom details so they can join on Tuesday afternoon, which will be 2 to 4 p.m.
Which will be the anniversary birth date of Leonard Howell.
So we'll have Brother Monty, Sister Kathy, Billy Howell as the children giving testimony of their experience at Pinnacle. We'll actually have Ras Miguel Lawn giving a legal perspective.
Brilliant.
So it should be, illuminating.
All
but
right.
the key thing is that is an issue we have to look at. Now, even this issue now of Pinnacle being made a National Heritage Site has become complicated and bogged down with internal, differences and different perspectives, which is unfortunate. But hopefully, something will be worked out.
Right, because these decisions cannot be made, and they are not usually made from any government office or agency. These decisions are usually made by the people, and when the people speak, the voice of the people is the voice of God. And when the people speak, the government people have to listen. It is simple. The heritage site in Pinnacle, the reason why they're talking about it is because the people spoke. Right? And I think that this is time for people to understand, Jamaican people, that the power lies with you, not within the government office, not within the government agency, but with you. You drive the change.
And that is good, and that's a fair point. But here's the issue, though, Kabu, is that the people, once you get a listening ear, has to be a coherent perspective and policy. Because
Michael, sometimes you just have to bound down somewhere. Michael, you don't have to be. People don't have to be coherent, right? Sometimes you just have to burn down somewhere. And I'm not saying this flippantly. I am saying that when hurt and pain and oppression is driving you, you can't even talk. When people have them boot on your neck, you can't even talk. There's no coherence. So sometimes you're not going to get the coherence. If we say we want Pinnacle back, then, and we're saying it and you're not understanding then we just have to go show you so we want Pinnacle back.
All right, so here's what's on the table. No, it's up for a decision to be made. I must say that there was an effort to actually grant free lots at Pinnacle as a heritage site.
I remember that. I remember that. Michael, the people led that, you know. Yeah? The people led that. Remember, the people led that in 2007. There was a big... It was under the leadership of Catherine Howell, who founded the Leonard Howell Foundation. Michael, it was under the leadership of IRFM and the Jamaica National Heritage Trust, chairmanship, Vereen Shepherd. That's how that happened, right? Okay. That's how that conversation started. We were there. We marched for that.
All right.
It never just come out of the blue. We marched for that. The Leonard Howell Foundation came out of that activism in 2006, 2007. IRFM and the Jamaica National Heritage Trust, led by Vereen Shepherd. So I know the story. I am totally out of time, but we have to correct our things, understand them the way they operate. That's why history is important.
That momentum that you created has not been capitalized on because the government then said, okay, we'll give you 3 lots. That was rejected. Then there was an attempt to give Rastafari 6 lots in 2017, and that was rejected. So we have 1 lot. I don't think that's anything to be happy about.
I don't think so either. Who's rejecting it? Who's rejecting it?
Messages, because if the government makes an attempt of the lots and you just reject it, then what's the message?
Yeah, but who rejected it? That's the question. And I'm going to give...
I'm not going to name them. There is a group within the Rastafari.
I know who rejected it, Michael. I'm saying, but, the Ministry of Culture, led by Babsy Grange at the time, and we must give Babsy her credit here, because she went out seriously to get this done. And she did, and she could have done more, and she was willing to do more. So I think that we just need to re-engage that space. Michael, I'm so sorry.
We need to re-engage that, and I'm so glad you said that, because I feel that if that is a possibility, then we have to re-engage it.
Yes. Yeah? I'm so sorry I'm out of time, Michael.
Thanks so much. So we give thanks that you're honoring Leonard Howell today, and give thanks all the time, Sister Capital.
Thank you. Oops. Did you lose Michael? Yeah, thank you, Michael. Inside of the Africa Forum, it is Running African. Thanks so much for staying with us. I'm going to go to the phone lines now to speak with a very, very special guest. She is the daughter of the man we've been talking about all morning, Leonard Howell. Catherine Howell is joining me on the phone lines. She established the Leonard Howell Foundation in honor of her father, Leonard Howell. Catherine, good morning. She's Leonard Howell's youngest daughter. Morning. How are you doing, sis?
Greetings, sister. How are you this beautiful morning? I
am good. Good to hear you. Thank you so much for calling. You caused me to drop everything and to change my program so that we could, in this space, pay tribute to and remember your dad, Leonard Howell. So thank you so much for that call. Thank you so much for reaching out.
It's an honor and a privilege to be on your program, and I just want to say thank you. Thank you, sister, for really bringing a new level of communication about Black history to Jamaica.
My duty and purpose to do so. Listen, you are the youngest daughter of this great Jamaican, this great African, this great Pan-African, this great Rastafari. Talk to us. What do you remember? How old were you when your dad passed? Because I know he passed in the 80s, so you would have remembered him very well. But how old were you?
Well, when my father passed, is that what you said?
Yes, when he passed.
Okay, first, let me say this. When my father passed away, it was in the 80s, and I was still in school, and I was living in the U.S.
Yes.
Before saying this morning, I just really want to give praises and honor to all the heroes and heroes that came out of Jamaica, including my dad and Marcus Garvey and many others from other Caribbean countries. And I want to give honor to His Imperial Majesty Haile Selassie I for giving us victory and for taking off the blind eyes on our eyes. And today I just want to give honor and praise to my father, the Honorable Dr. Percival Howell, for showing us the light. That we were in darkness, and he really showed us the light and lead us out of darkness. It's like being in a tunnel. And I just want to give recognition and gratification to Howell for the contribution to liberation and salvation of our people. And one of the other things, to pay tribute to my dad today, I just want to honor him. He gave many knowledge of self and history. My dad really gave many the understanding of tradition and religion and the wisdom to know the difference. For me, that is really, really, big. Really big. Really big.
You, Catherine, and we worked very closely together in 2006, 2007. Yourself, Vereen Shepherd, and those of us who were in search of your father, meeting with the Howellites. I remember that that evening that we sat on. Whose veranda was it that we sat on, Catherine? That day, was it 2006?
Yes.
Yeah. Whose veranda was it?
Was it around Tredegar Park?
It was. Yes.
It Pinnacle?
No, it was Tredegar Park. So it was.
Yes, and it's interesting that you brought this up because here we go. This far, we've been on the battlefield working for the next generation. I want everybody to realize that what we're doing right now is not for ourselves. We're trying to open doors for the next generation. And yes, indeed, sister, we were actually in the Ethiopian Salvation Church,
that is
where Sister Gertrude lived.
Yeah, that is true. Yes. And I remember I did some interviews with the elders there, recorded some interviews with the elders there, and then we went to, I mean, that was so, for me, that was a moment of knowing. It was discovering a whole a part of Jamaica that I didn't even know existed.
Praise be to Jah. Praise be to Jah.
Because we hadn't heard much about Leonard Howell before that. Yes, a little, but not a whole lot. There's so much that we did not know. That when you carried out in those spaces, it really meant something. And to go to the church and so on, that was really, really beautiful. You started the foundation, the Leonard Howell Foundation. Talk to us about the Leonard Howell Foundation in memory of your father. Why did you start that, and what is it?
Very good question indeed, my sister. I started the Leonard Howell Foundation because I knew that my father left a legacy. And we had to do something about it. My father had many wives, and someone would say, whether my father went through the court, and so he was like an African chief that lives in a village. So he has many children. And some people would say, these are illegitimate children. Let's not even talk about the word illegitimate, because white men have so many illegitimate kids out here. If all of them should go knocking on their ancestors' doors, can you imagine the $1 million that we would bring? So let's not even go with illegitimacy, because, my dad was a man of dignity. But I started the foundation simply because nobody actually knew about when my dad died in 81. It's like I'm talking to people and the legacy that he left behind. I thought it was important because it's historical, and I thought it was important that everybody should know the contribution that this man made, in terms of sacrificing his life, for his people. And having talked to a few brothers, like Brother Miguel Lawn, and Brother Ian Boyd, and I remember it was Plana at the time that was still alive, and a few others, brothers, and they were saying, sister, you got to do something about the man, your old man land and everything. So I went to Miguel and we sat down and, we talked about things, and also I remember another brother that I spoke to, a couple of brethren anyway. But I just wanted to give thanks to Brother Miguel Lawn, because in terms of the legal paper and everything, putting things together,
yes.
He was ready to do this with an open heart.
Mm-hmm.
And I have to say, we're grateful, because the legacy of my dad is very important.
Yeah.
So I decided to go and file the register office and establish a foundation, which I was chairperson of for many years.
Mm-hmm.
And so my older brother Monty, at some point took over chairship.
Mm-hmm.
But as a family, we try to work together. I mean, every family have their squabble, but as a family, we just try to work together and try to see if we can get that ball into the goalpost. So,
what are some of the main issues that the foundation is dealing with now in terms of preserving the legacy? Are there any outstanding things that you're working on right now?
Oh yes, absolutely.
Tell us about that.
It is so imperative that Rasta have a place that they consider the birthplace from which the culture just, emerges and just went up like astronaut up into the global community. And we need to find a way to build a monument to honor my father up in the Pinnacle, and also to have some kind of educational institution up there so people could know and learn. Maybe even a black library. Of course, we have to think of a tabernacle too, which I'm proposing to the government, and to have the Pinnacle, not just a little partial spot, but the pinnacle of Pinnacle become a Rasta heritage site. And I have been agitating from back, God knows when.
But so where is that now in terms of the agitation? What have you heard? What's the process?
We have a organization here in Jamaica who happens to be a part of the Rasta group that call themselves the Millennium Council, the EDUM. But anyway, we have groups of people seems to be always getting involved with Rasta business, thinking that they are in control of what Rasta is doing. And this is not true, because legally they have no right to go and decide on what the whole Rasta community, because they're not even doing things collectively. So they sent an objection to the Heritage Trust when the government decided to approve those lots. We had maybe, I think it was 5 or 6 lots or 7 lots that was allocated towards the heritage, Rasta heritage, and they objected because they have something dealing with monument against heritage, and they seem to be wanting to decide what it is that.
So the question is, because we know about the objection, and we have discussed that at length in this space when the objection came in. Remember, they objected to what we were agitating for here also in this space in terms of making Pinnacle a heritage site. My understanding is that they objected on a few issues, a few principles, and it would be good to have them in the space to remind us of what those objections were. But the question is, does that objection still stand in terms of what are you in interacting with the Jamaica National Heritage Trust, the Ministry of Culture? Does that objection stand in the space, or are they looking again at how to make Pinnacle? Because I've heard since that Minister Grange talk about the plans that she has for Pinnacle. So I think that she's moved past those objections. Can't talk for her, but that's the impression I got. So what are you hearing?
Well, so far, I have to, say this, and I'm giving shout out to Sister Grange, because she is really what I call a black queen, an empress, and she is all about culture. And I'm sure that her intentions are good, and I do feel deep within that we are going to accomplish our goal under her directorship, and also with the government, with the Prime Minister presently that is also involved, is Honorable Bruce Andrew, Ole. I have to say that too. So, with those two people behind us, we can't miss it. I'm positive that we are going to be victorious. We're going to fulfill the goal.
All right, and what is the goal?
The goal is to achieve those lots that was allocated to the Rasta Heritage Site, and to make sure that we build a monument to honor our father, and also to build whatever the Pinnacle Committee decided on, in terms that's going to be of interest to the next generation.
The question, though, is are these two things at odds with each other, or are they in tandem with each other? In terms of looking back at what we were talking about, the objection, I think my understanding when I did those interviews back in the day about the objection is that they were talking more about what a heritage, make it a heritage site would mean. They needed more information, determining what people were asking for, what was going to be done, and so on, and also to look at the rest of Pinnacle. But my question is, and it still remains a relevant question, I think, as to once these lots are made, I think it was 7 lots that they were looking at initially, and also involved in that too, we must say, was Lalita Davis Mattis. And so while those 7 initial lots that were identified, that didn't happen, does that negate looking at the rest of Pinnacle and land that is owed to black people through Leonard Howell and to the Howellites? What would that mean once you make these 7 lots or 6 lots a national heritage site, and who owns a lot and what will be done on the lot? I mean, there's many questions to be answered.
Yes, and I possibly don't have all the answers to all the questions you have, but let me say this to one of the questions. The lots that we are right now agitating about, and that is the lot that the government proposed through the National Heritage Trust in having a monument built up there, and also, in terms of the Rasta Heritage Site. Now, once that's been done, I'm sure that we will form a committee and decide exactly what are we going to build on those lots. And moving forward on that, I am positive and sure that at some point in time, the developers that have confiscated the lot, or Pinnacle, under adverse possession, will have to at some point give back portion of those lots or land, not lots, to Rasta. Because if you didn't go out there and buy something with your money, you shouldn't want to fight other people that you want to take something from someone and not giving something back.
And I think that's a very good point, and I like the way Miguel talk about perverse possession as opposed to adverse, because it really make a lot of sense that it's highway robbery. You hijack the land literally. I think that there needs to be a greater concentration of our efforts and time on this issue, because once we get distracted, you lose it. And so that over time...
And, it's something my dad once says to me. He says, Catherine, Mr. Never Ashinal, a prominent Jewish lawyer background, he was Jewish, he had background of Jewish ancestors. He argued the rights, in terms of protecting property rights. And he argued that no one could not confiscate another person, adequately confiscate another person's property without giving some proper compensation.
Well,
and here he mentioned, it says to me, imagine At emancipation, the planters were adequately compensated for freeing the slaves. And I, Leonard Howell, have never been compensated for the crime that was committed against me and the rest of people in Jamaica. No, Catherine, you think about that. That's exactly the words he used.
And we are thinking about that, and we're doing more than thinking about that. I'm happy that the Internal Reparations Committee, the subcommittee within the NCR, is on this. I hope they don't drag their feet too much on this, but we can't leave it in their hands. I think the people who want to see this, the people who hate injustice, who are against oppression, must speak out, must speak up immediately for compensation, reparations for the Pinnacle diaspora, for the descendants of Leonard Howell, for the Howellites are still alive and their descendants. My sister, I'm so out of time, but I want to thank you so much for your call again. Thank you for the work that you continue to do in keeping your father's name alive. Thank you so much, Catherine.
It was a pleasure, sister, and once again, I look forward to seeing you again so we can break bread together.
Right, I think we should go.
When all of this virus and whatever it is, at your own convenience, of course.
Most definitely, my sister. Most definitely, my sister.
Be good, sister.
You too. All right, what good. All right. So much injustice in this little nation, in Jamaica. So much that we have not repaired. So much blood still crying out. And when you look at the crime and the violence, and if you're a spiritual person, you're taking it from different levels as to what has happened to us, what has become of us. So much that we have not atoned for as a nation, so much that we have done to each other outside of the enslavers I'm talking now, and continue to do to each other, that there is blood on our hands. I think that is about time that we look within and determine that enough is enough, whether it's political tribalism or tourism. Enough is enough. It is better to be free than to govern or misgovern yourself, than to be governed by anyone else. And I think Leonard Howell saw this, understood it. It is far better to be free to govern or misgovern yourself than to be governed by anyone else. They destroyed Pinnacle because they realized and recognized that when black people get together with independence on their mind and emancipation and liberation on their minds, there will be a force to reckon with.